Hi, my name is Ken Cerney. I am the creator of this new podcast called Icarus Tales, Stories of Surviving Our Egos. And the reason we call it that is it comes basically from the Icarus story, Greek mythology, Icarus story. Father Daedalus and Icarus were imprisoned, and his father being an inventor, they created these. He created wings of wax and feathers. And in the process, he warned his son not to fly too close to the sun so that it wouldn't melt his wax wings. And of course,
Yep.
being young and full of, has quite an ego himself, he did fly too high. His wings melted, he crashed and died. So that's Icarus Tales. Well, what we're hoping to do is talk about stories where we survived. So I got one of my favorite helicopter pilots in the world, my daughter, Hannah. She, as you can see, her background there. She was a headquarters company commander,
That's
as
right.
an aviation commander, flying Blackhawks. But beyond that, I'm going to let her tell her story just a little bit about who she is and kind of maybe how she got to being a pilot.
Well, that's a good question actually, as far as how I became a pilot. But it was I grew up as an Army brat, obviously, because my father, who is you, was in the military as an aviator, and never really thought much about aviation until I decided to join ROTC when I was in high school, and it was more I don't know, it was very out of my comfort zone to join the military because it was very much, I don't know, not something I would really do other than I just kind of decided that, like, hey, I'm physically and mentally able to do this. I might as well go. And plus, I really wanted to go to school in an out-of-state school. And so I decided to apply for a scholarship and got the scholarship. And then it was actually not until like end of my sophomore year, maybe beginning of my junior year of ROTC, when we had to decide like what we wanted to do when we joined the military. And I was like, you know what, let me try and be a pilot, because I really didn't want to have a desk job. And that was one of the few things, at least back then in 2009, 2010, that women could do in the military. That was, it was the only combat arms, the only combat
Oh, there
arms
you go.
branch that women could do at the time, because you couldn't be infantry, you couldn't be artillery, whatever. So it was something that I could actually do. That was not just sitting around at a desk all day, although that's what it ended up being for me anyways. But so I decided to try and do aviation, and even though everyone told me like, oh, well, only like the top tier ROTC get that, and you're gonna have to really push yourself and all this other stuff, and I was like, well, I'm just gonna do it because that's, well, one of the things I learned from you was always make the Army tell you something or tell you no twice. So so that was, I was fortunate that I went to a small school, and so we had a very good ROTC program. We didn't have a lot of people, but we had high quality people because we got a lot of individual attention. And even though my grades weren't the best, I was able to do good on my PT test and so all my ROTC stuff and everything to rank high enough in order to get aviation as my branch. So I commissioned in 2011, went down to flight school, Fort Rucker, was there for 17 months, which is actually pretty short compared to most people, just because I was there at a good time where there wasn't a very big bubble in between classes. So from there, I went through flight school, was able to get my first choice of advanced airframe, and I chose the UH-60 Mike model, which was pretty new at the time too, because you could still choose between the Alpha Limos or the Mike model. I wanted the Mike model because it was the new hotness at the time. So from there, I went to Fort Bragg, which is now Fort Liberty, if you're following all the name changes for bases. So Fort Bragg was my first duty station, and I basically went there because that's where my husband was stationed at the time. And which we had just gotten married to. Did about 3 or 4 years at Fort Bragg. Started off in the S3 shop there. Became a platoon leader in an assault company with Blackhawks. Deployed as a platoon leader for ended up being about 8 months. While I was over there, I switched positions to become the XO. I earned my PC rank, or I became pilot in command while I was downrange. Then came back, was switched to headquarters company as an XO for a couple months, and then went down to the career course at Fort Rucker again, which is now Fort Novacell. After that, we got stationed up at Fort Drum in New York. While I was there, I served some time as the Aviation Support Battalion S3. So we were in charge of all of the fuelers, the large, the big level maintenance. So not just like the company level, but the bigger level stuff, and a bunch of all of the logistics side of aviation is what we did. And I was the S3, so I was in charge of operations and plans for all that. We went to Germany for 9 months. While we were there, went kind of all over Europe. Our battalion went all over Europe. I spent most of my time in Germany, did a little bit of time down in Bulgaria for a big training exercise, which was very, very interesting. Got a lot of good experience there. Then came back, did some company commander time in our aviation support battalion, General Aviation Support Battalion, the GSAB, if you're familiar with the acronyms. And then, so I was a HHC company commander then, and then decided to get out of the Army in order to become a mom. So I am now a stay-at-home mom of a almost 3-year-old little boy, and with another one on the way. So that was a very long explanation of who I am.
Yeah, well, you get that naturally from me also, so that
yes,
just makes sense.
The ability to ramble.
Yeah, it's a skill.
You can edit all that out.
So you've got a lot of experience and both flying and with other things going on. And one of the things that, again, this is about telling stories of our ego getting away from us, or sometimes our ego helping us out. Ego is nothing more than it's what Carl Jung talked about, is basically the unconscious part of our personality, of who we are. And so it's the part that we don't necessarily control unless we're thinking about it. And that's part of the problem with the ego. I know you talked about a cross country one time that you were a little nervous about taking in order to get from Drum. You had to go get a part or something?
Well, there was it wasn't necessarily nervous, but it was definitely the most like piloting that I've had to do on a single flight. But we were actually down at JRTC in Louisiana.
Oh yeah, Fort Polk, Louisiana.
I can't remember. Yeah, Fort Polk. Thank you. Yeah, we were at Fort Polk. We were like just wrapping up a training being out in the box. So I think we had like 1 day left out there. So we'd been in the field for like 2.5 weeks. I think it was. We were all miserable, but it was a funny situation where one of the aircraft, when they landed for one of the air assaults, it was under NVGs, so they didn't see this tiny little tree that was maybe about this wide, right where they were landing. And when they landed, it went whoop, and every single rotor blade, all 4 rotors, hit this tree. Fortunately, it was only the tip caps that got hit. So if you're not familiar with the UH-60 Mike rotor blades, like the last, I don't even know how long, but maybe foot of the blade is like an extra piece that they add onto it.
Yep.
Pretty much for that very reason. So that way you're only hurting the tip and not the entire rotor blade. So it was just the tip caps that got damaged, which is a big money saver. But the problem is you have to have these special bolts in order to put new ones on. So they're the like self-locking bolts. Well, there were none of these bolts anywhere in Fort Polk. The closest ones were at Fort Campbell in Kentucky, which was about a little over 3-hour flight for us to get there. So and I only remember that because we were allowed 8 hours of flight time a day before we needed an extension, which required a signature from somebody higher up and all that stuff. So we were limited to 8 hours. We were only allowed to be in the air for 8 hours. Well, we had and we had, for some reason too, it was cheaper for us to fly an entire Black Hawk all the way to Fort Campbell and back than it was for them to FedEx a box of bolts overnight. I don't know why, but it was. But so that's why we ended up going. It was me and a warrant officer who was also on staff. I was the HHCXO at the time, so I really didn't fly much, and they didn't need me really. So they sent me and one of the warrant officers on staff went to go do it, and then we grabbed one of our crew chiefs who we could trust, and he knew somebody at Fort Campbell in the maintenance department there, and he was like, "Hey, I've got this buddy. They have the bolts. Let's go get them." But on the way there, we had probably at least a 20-knot headwind, maybe more. It was a pretty massive headwind, almost a direct headwind. So we were going slow, and so even though like our true airspeed, we were keeping it right at probably 120, well maybe less than that, because we actually had to go into the computer and the aircraft and look up our which one was it? I can't remember if it was the max endurance or the max distance airspeed in order to get to our field stop, because we were there were only so many places along the way that we could stop and get fuel that was contracted out with the government, because you could only you have to make sure that your government credit card is going to work wherever you land. And so we had one stop that we had to stop at in order to get fuel before we got there. And so that was the big thing, was on the way there, we had to kept checking our airspeed, kept checking our fuel burn rates and all that stuff in order to make sure that we could actually land with enough fuel, because we didn't want to have to dip into our reserve time, because that's a whole other problem too, and all that. So we actually, I forget the exact numbers of what we landed with, but we were basically minutes from hitting our reserve time when we landed for fuel.
So
on the way back too.
Let me stop you for a minute, because right there gives me something to ask you a question about. When you're that close to your reserves, were you in the reserves, or were you just close to the reserves?
We were close to the reserves. Okay. We never actually hit the reserves. So we definitely discussed that a couple times, and all right, when do we make that decision as far as because we had a couple other airports in along the route that was well, we can stop here if we really, really need to, but they don't have gas for us. And that's a whole nother problem that you run into, is having to pay for that gas. And
so what kept you going? I mean, did obviously it was probably, if it's anything like me, I'm nervous when I start getting close to my fuel. And I'm not sure where I'm at.
Well, that's one of the good things about the Mike model too, is that we had very accurate maps, and we had the FMS computer in the Mike model has a 3-minute burn calculator. So every 3 minutes, it re-updates the burn rate of what you're doing. So we were going through the FMS, double checking the burn rate. Whoever was not on the controls was also doing constant fuel calculations. Our crew chief in the back was he was one of our more senior guys, so he was doing burn rate calculations too for us, and we were all double checking, making sure that we were all on the same page. There was a lot of a lot of communication going on as a crew. Just making sure that we were talking like, hey, you guys comfortable? Like, I think we can make it. Let's keep on pushing. But yeah, and then just like I said, it was a lot of piloting going on. You know, the stuff, you know, the not wiggling the sticks kind of piloting going on, because it was, you know, that's the easy part, is maneuvering the controls, but the
I've done that many times.
doing all the other stuff was the complicated part. We did luck out too, where, because I'm not very familiar with Campbell's layout, but they actually have two separate airfields there that are you know, they're I don't know how far apart they are, but one of them had gas, the other one was where our contact was. So the plan was to go get gas because we were running low, then swing by where the guy was with the bolts to before we head back, because we were at that point we were running short on time because we only had the 8 hours, plus we had to get down before sunset and all that stuff, because we didn't have a working searchlight, I think was our problem too. So like legally we weren't supposed to fly after sunset. Yeah, it was a very interesting flight.
So
but,
thinking about who you are, I know we've talked a little bit about personalities over the years. You've heard me talk about them. What did your personality do for you on that trip?
That's a good question. Honestly, that might be one of the reasons why they picked me to go, is because they knew that I wasn't gonna mess around. Like I'm you know, like if I'm given a job to do, I was like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to make sure that it gets done. So I think that might be one of the reasons why they chose the two of us, was they're like, well, A, we needed the flight time, and B, like both of us were very like, hey, we're not going to try and push this. Like we need to get this done and get back. But
okay.
So I think there was a, you know, they didn't have to worry about us like stopping for food somewhere and you know, or like taking our time and whatever. They yeah, that may be part of it. But I don't know.
Well, we can I have your risk assessment from before if you want to